So I'm finally making the video that I've been asked about and promising for far too long. It's an overview of all the setups that I've tried so far. First, the 20-second summary of my skating background. I learned to inline skate as a kid. I don't remember exactly how old I was, maybe 8 or 10. And all of my skating was playing pickup street roller hockey with friends in parking lots. And I pretty much did that until I was 16, and then I stopped until I was 38, which is in 2020, on October 25th, is the day that I decided to, as a 38-year-old, get back on skates. And 6 weeks after that was my first upload to this channel. And somewhere within that 6 weeks, I discovered Bill Stoppard's channel, and that's what ultimately inspired me to leave the hockey rink and try urban or city skating. So let's get into the setups. I'll be talking about them in chronological order in which I tried them. So first up are these Nike Bauer Mega 4070 hockey skates.
I started on these hockey skates because they're the skates I happen to have. I bought them, used them to shoot around a rink by myself maybe 3 times, and then they sat in my basement for a decade. They're also way too big for me. These are size US 10.5, and for example, my FRSL are US 7.5. They're hockey skates, so they have an integrated liner and the frame is riveted to the boot. The wheel configuration on these, like many hockey skates, is high-low, so the back wheels are 80 millimeters and the front wheels are actually 72 millimeters. I think nowadays the most common hockey high-low setups are 80 millimeters in the back and 76 in the front instead of 72. Now, high-low is not to be confused with rockered, by the way. These are still a flat setup. The idea behind high-low is that the back wheels are obviously higher and the front are lower, and that gives a forward lean to the skates, which is great for accelerating and pivoting, making them very agile. Of course, this is good for a sport like hockey. They have very little ankle support compared to an urban boot, however. Again, this gives the ability to change directions and angles very quickly, but riding down stairs, for example, they probably aren't as ideal for. Hockey skates tick a lot of boxes for me. I like that they're lightweight. They have an integrated liner, low to the ground, and they're simple because they're laces only. But there are 2 big downsides to them for what I was looking for in my next skate. The first is that lack of ankle support I mentioned. Again, not a problem for skating in general, and obviously not a problem for hockey, but also not ideal for things like stair rides, jumps, and other movements common in city skating, which I knew I wanted to explore. The second is that you can't remove the frames, so you're locked into a single setup. At least they're not meant to be removed. I believe you could change them by bringing them to a shop, but you can't just do it yourself with a hex wrench.
So I skated the hockey skates for a few months as I got, kind of my legs back under me, and before getting this next setup, which is the FR1 Deluxe Intuition with the Intuition liner.
Again, I got these after being inspired by Bill Stoppard to do more than skate in a hockey rink or play hockey on skates. Of course, you can city skate in hockey skates. Bill's done it himself in plenty of his videos, but I wanted something more purpose-built for the streets. I'll be honest, I was hesitant to try a plastic-shelled urban boot with a removable liner. I really liked my hockey skates and I was comfortable in them. The thought of a liner put me off because I didn't like the idea of possible movement between the liner and the boot. They also just looked too heavy and bulky and overly complicated. But I wanted to try different frames. Especially appealing to me at the time were the Endless 90 and the Endless 100. The main reason I went with the FR1 Deluxe was the Intuition liner. I saw so many people online saying they're the gold standard, so I had to try them. It was both cheaper to not buy the liners aftermarket, but also good to know they were designed specifically for the boot. If I'm being honest, at first, my feet felt like prisoners in such a high-ankled and supportive boot. But I was trying to be open-minded and explore. After a few sessions, I decided I liked them, and my apprehensions about a hard-shell urban boot had gone away. I really did like the Intuition liner, though it's important to note here that I have yet to try a boot with anything but an Intuition liner, so I can't compare them to other stock liners. I really liked the fact that they were supportive, even though I felt kind of trapped in them at first. I learned to like the support and really lean into it, and realize how much on my edges I could get in these supportive skates. I like the fact that they were very durable as well. I had started wearing holes in my hockey skates from practicing parallel slides. And they had really good shock absorption as well. Again, these are built for the streets to take that kind of abuse.
So the Endless 90, to this date, still my favorite frame.
When I bought the FR1s, my intention was to also buy the Endless 90 to replace the stock frames, but I did want to make sure I was okay with a hard shell boot first. And as I just mentioned, I was after a few sessions, and I ordered the Endless 90. So I only spent about 10 days on the stock 4x80mm flat frames that came with the skates. These frames have what Endless calls their balanced rocker. In short, it's a very minimal rocker that's around 1mm instead of something like the traditional 2mm, the Nano rocker that existed for decades. I realized early on, after my first set of new wheels on my hockey skates, that a rocker was basically a requirement for me. I much prefer a rocker to a flat setup because a rocker provides more agility. Albeit the increase in agility means a decrease in stability, but the rocker is subtle enough on these that they still feel very stable, solid, and smooth. Now these frames actually have two setups, the 4x90mm balanced rocker or a tri-skate 3x110mm flat, but my experience with the 3x110 will be discussed later in this video as I'm doing things chronologically. I knew I wanted to try Endless 90s and or Endless 100s, and I agonized over which to get for a while. Though I was primarily urban skating, I was also interested in flatland and wizard stuff. It seemed like the longer wheelbase of the 100s might be better for flatland, but I wasn't sure how they'd feel for general urban skating. I ultimately chose 90s because it felt like the quote-unquote safe bet, to make sure they didn't feel too big for my feet or unwieldy. After all, I had only been back on my skates for a few months. I was in my first urban boots, and I was still getting comfortable with everything. By the way, my feet are 265mm long, which usually puts me somewhere between sizes EU 40 to 42, depending on brand and skate. So my feet are on the smaller end. The Endless 90 wheelbase is 276mm, which is 11mm longer than my foot, which I think is important. I deliberately wanted a frame longer than my foot for increased front-to-back stability, for both urban skating and flatland skating. These frames felt amazing the first time I tried them, and they were everything I'd hoped they'd be. The increased stability was there. They were very agile from the rocker, but not squirrely. They felt stiff and responsive. They handled all surfaces better than the 4x80 stock frame and had better top speeds. The only thought I had after trying these frames was, now I want to try the 100s. And that thought was literally during my first session on these. I didn't know what going from 4x80 to 4x90 would feel like. And also, I was essentially coming from high-low 7280 setup, which was even shorter than 4x80, because these arrived like 10 days after I got my FR1s, as I had mentioned before. That being said, I instantly adjusted to 4x90. It took literally no time for me to get used to it. In fact, it instantly felt better to me than anything I'd tried yet. I truly loved them.
So that brings us to the Endless 100.
As I just mentioned, immediately after trying the 90s, I wanted to know what these would be like, but I did wait around 5 months before I decided to actually purchase a set. By this time, I was fully back in the swing of things. I was comfortable in my skates, I could skate the city aggressively and comfortably. Within the first session on these skates, on these frames, I was comfortable. I was cautious with crossovers because of the additional length, but it only took about 20 minutes and I wasn't even paying attention to it anymore. Much like the 90s, these skates have two setups, 4x100 balanced rocker and 3x110mm flat. Unlike my Endless 90s, I have yet to try the 3x110 flat setup on these Endless 100s specifically. Right away, these felt like quote-unquote endless frames, meaning the smooth and stable feel of the 4x100 balanced rocker was familiar after experiencing the 90mm version. To be clear though, the rockering on the Endless 90s and the Endless 100s are not the same. I'll read this quote from Endless's website. The amount of rocker for each of our frames is tuned to the wheelbase length and has been meticulously dialed in by folks that love to skate as much as you do. In other words, it's not the same absolute amount of rocker for each frame size. Now that being said, both frames have that smooth, responsive, stiff, sturdy feeling that Endless delivers. The Endless 100 are just as much of a joy to use as the Endless 90. The longer wheelbase at 303mm, which is 27mm longer than the 276 of the 90s, provides even more of that front-to-back stability for both flatland tricks as well as general skating, hill bombing, etc. I feel stable down hills on my 90s, and on these I feel unshakable. The larger wheels also afford more cruising speed. When I say cruising speed, by the way, it means once you've already reached a certain speed, because the 100s take more effort to get up to speed, but maintain the speed with less effort. At a standstill, they're simply more cumbersome and harder to get moving than the 90s. I see people say that the 100s are quote-unquote faster than the 90s, and I don't think that's unilaterally true. Yes, they maintain speed better, but they take longer to get going. When I'm city skating, I may only get 200 meters into a sprint or skate before I have to change directions, slow down, etc., which can make the 90s actually faster. So speed, in my opinion, requires context. If I were to race someone in a 100-meter dash, for example, I might even pick my high-low hockey skates because they're built for quick acceleration. But in a longer race, they wouldn't do as well. I think a lot of folks are or were in my shoes before I got either and trying to decide which ones they want, specifically between the Endless 90 and the Endless 100. I can say this, for my smallish foot size at 265mm, and the style of skating I like to do best, which is ripping through a city like I stole something, I prefer the 90s. But that is 100% preference, and honestly, I haven't had a bad skate on either of these frames. If you're more into the cruising style, or maybe flatland, wizards type skating, or just have longer feet, you may prefer the 100s. Then again, you may not. Honestly, I feel like ideally you could just rent frames before you buy them, because it's ultimately down to personal preference and feel. You don't know what you like best between multiple options until you've tried each of them.
So I skated the Endless 100 for, I think, like 5 months. I think it was on the 90s for 5 months, and then the 100s for 5 months before trying the NN Dragon.
These were my first 5-wheel frames designed for flatland skating. I have a dedicated video with my initial impressions of this frame, which I'll link. It's a 5x80mm rocker setup with a wheelbase of 324mm, the longest frame I own. Of course, because of the rocker, it does not feel as long as it actually is. I'm not a big wizard skater, but I bought these with the intention of doing more wizard skating and honing my skills in that discipline. I bought them in winter because I was anticipating inclement weather like snow and ice, which forces me to skate under cover in places like parking garages. Of course, flatland skating doesn't require as much space as urban or fitness skating, so I figured I'd spend my poor weather days learning how to do all the swivelly stuff that competent wizard skaters make look so cool. My first impressions were that they were swivelly like you'd expect a 5-wheel rockered frame built for flatland skating to feel. But they also felt soft, for lack of a better term. I was skating softer wheels than I was used to, FR Street Invaders at 84A hardness. The combination of the rocker and the Street Invader wheels, and its contrast against my Endless 100s with 86A undercover Team Blank wheels, felt like completely different. I did manage to record some city flows in these frames as well, which were enjoyable, even though the frame was designed for flatland skating. Unfortunately, I didn't get too far into winter before slipping on some ice in my driveway, which put me off my skates for the remainder of the season with a sprained ankle. And I haven't actually been back on these frames since then. That being said, I did enjoy the time I spent with them, and I encourage you to check out my video with my first impressions.
So once my ankle was healed and I was back to skating, I got back on my 90s. So I had been on my 90s for like 5 months. I'd been on my 100s for 5 months, the Dragons for a couple months, and then my ankle healed and I got back on the 90s. And that's when I really realized that it was my favorite, my favorite setup so far. But what I tried next was a different setup on the 90s. And that is the 3x110 setup.
So yeah, I put off trying the 3x110 tri-skate configuration of my Endless 90s for 14 months because I told myself I wouldn't like it. I thought it was a gimmick. I thought they were just slapping an extra hole in the frame because why not? After all, I knew that rockered setups made me happy and I didn't like the sticky feeling of a flat setup. I especially wasn't interested in a 3x110 tri-skate with such a long wheelbase. However, I learned quickly after trying it that I enjoyed this setup and I was wrong. I made a dedicated video where I discussed this. Though I'll always prefer my rocker, I've grown to enjoy this setup for its own merits. It's fun to do trail skating in, or have something that bombs hills both faster and with more stability than the rockered 90s setup. They're great for the suburbs where I spend more time skating even though most of my videos are in the city. I think it ultimately makes me a better skater because switching up setups exercises your brain and muscles differently. And when I say differently, I mean it. The two setups on this one frame are completely different, night and day. But I think that's a good thing, especially considering you don't have to change the frame. I already rotate my wheels every other session, so sometimes I'll toss the 110s on and give them a roll. I encourage you to check out the video I made on this realization that I do actually like this setup.
So this next setup is my current daily go-to setup. Not even daily, it's just my favorite setup for pretty much everything. And that is these, well, the frame is the 4x90 Endless 90s, but the boot is the big difference here, and this is the FRSL.
As I mentioned early in the video, when I decided to leave my hockey skates behind, I wasn't sure I wanted to get a hard shell plastic boot. At the time, I also considered getting a carbon slalom boot, even though urban skating was likely to be what I did most. I really like the idea of an integrated liner, just like my hockey skates. Less moving parts, more power transfer. This may be stupid of me, but what shocked me the most when I first skated these was just how stiff and unforgiving the carbon was. I'm not sure why I was expecting anything different, but I think tears streamed down my face the first time I did a jump because my toes smashed right into the front of the skate when I landed. In short though, I love these skates. They've replaced my urban skates for everything, and I am sold on carbon boots with integrated liners. That being said, I don't think a carbon boot is better, quote unquote, necessarily, though I do prefer it. That unforgiving carbon means you feel everything beneath your feet, especially rough terrain, stairs, jumps, etc. There's essentially no shock absorption to these skates the way they come. I have no way of scientifically measuring power transfer, but I honestly feel it. They're more of an extension of my feet than my FR1s ever felt like. It's worth saying, however, that these do just fit me better than my FR1. I always felt like I was in between sizes in the FR1, but these SL seem just about right. They're very snug, but also very comfortable. I will say that the break-in process was worse on these than my FR1, but once broken in, they felt fantastic. Although they're fully heat moldable, I haven't done that yet because I just don't have any problems with the fit. Everyone says that FR skates fit wide, but these don't feel big on me, and my feet are medium width. They come up significantly lower on my ankle than my FR1, but because both the boot and cuff are carbon, they still have all the support I need for my style of skating. So I get increased ankle mobility, but I don't lack support. Probably the biggest downside of these boots is the mounting system. They're the 5-hole mount, which only allows 165mm mount frames, unlike my FR1s, which have a 7-hole mount, which accommodates 165, 180, and 195 mount frames. I was not happy knowing that my Endless 100 wouldn't work on these because those use 180 millimeters. But I also knew I preferred the 90s, and I'd always have my FR1s as well, so I decided to go for it. I love these skates. Speaking of Bill Stoppard, he's been looking for new skates since deciding to move on from Adapt, and I mentioned in a comment on one of his videos how much I enjoy my FR-SL. I'm excited to see, by the way, what he finally picks for his new setup. I plan on doing a more dedicated and more detailed review of these in a video, so stay tuned for that.
Okay, so that brings us to my current setup, my newest setup, the one that I've been skating for the past 4 weeks. That is, again, the FR-SL boot, but these endless arc frames.
When Endless announced these frames, I was excited to see what they had cooked up in the 5-wheel flatland frame category, and I happily pre-ordered them. I've been skating them, as I said, for over 4 weeks, and I have a dedicated video about them you can check out. These are the standard arc frames, by the way, with a wheelbase of 316 millimeters. Also available are the Arc ES, which is slightly longer with a wheelbase of 324 millimeters. At a surface level, there are two main differences between these frames and the NN Dragons I spoke about earlier. The first are the wheel configurations. There are 2 of them, and they're both different than the Dragons. Both configurations have 3x76mm wheels in the middle, but you can put either 80mm or 84mm wheels in the first and last positions. The second is that in addition to choosing the size of the first and last wheels, they have multiple rockering configurations by way of different sized rockerable axles. There are 2 kinds of axles, the standard and what Endless calls the Arc Deluxe rocker axles, each of which have 2 different settings. The Deluxe axles, by the way, are not included with the frame and must be purchased separately. So altogether, there are 5 different rockering configurations with this frame. Again, I have a video dedicated to this frame, and I go over all of the rockering configurations available. To be honest, whether I ended up using these frames much or not, I was still happy to buy these because I was supporting a company that I think makes great products. I was expecting good quality and thoughtful engineering from Endless, but I wasn't expecting how these frames felt, especially as an urban frame. By the way, I had a great urban session in them last week that will be in an upcoming edit, so stay tuned. Simply put, I like these better than my NN Dragon frames for both flatland and urban skating. They don't feel soft like I remarked about the Dragon frames. They're very rigid, but they roll incredibly smooth. They just feel nice under your feet. Of course, they're swivelly like any 5-wheel rockered frame, but they're also great to just roll forward on, to stride in, and to just feel under your feet. Flatland skating aside, I was not expecting these to feel as fast, responsive, smooth, and fun as they do for just regular or urban skating. I think they've truly delivered on the promise of a frame that can satiate both flatland and urban skating enthusiasts. I'm not saying it would be my favorite urban frame per se, but there were times on the Dragons when I felt like I was on my flatland frames, quote unquote. But when I'm on these arc frames, I forget they're even a 5-wheel frame. Their long wheelbase and low profile provide great control, power transfer, and ability to land jumps. Again, I've only been skating these for a little over a month, but I'm really enjoying them thus far.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of my setup journey. Thanks for watching. Again, I made this video because multiple viewers had asked for a video where I talked about, the various setups I've tried. So hopefully that delivered for the folks who were looking for it. Your support is tremendously appreciated, as always. Not just the people that asked for this video, but everyone that likes, comments, subscribes, etc. And it doesn't go unnoticed, so thank you very much, and I will see you in the next one.